cut them off and grow quietly? What if the people holding you back are not your enemies, but the ones who call themselves your closest friends? What if the most powerful decision a person can make has nothing to do with working harder, waking up earlier, or reading another self-help book, but simply choosing to go quiet and walk away? Think about this. There was a man, simple man, average life. He had a group of friends he had known for 10 years. Every time he tried to do something new, start a business, learn a skill, change his habits, someone in that group had something to say. A joke here, a doubt there, small comments that felt harmless, but slowly, without even realizing it, he stopped trying. Not because he failed, because he got tired of explaining himself to people who were never going to understand him anyway. The day he stopped talking about his dreams to those people, everything changed. Not overnight, but it changed. Buddhism has known this secret for over 2,500 years, and it is not complicated. It does not require a mountain, a monk's robe, or years of meditation. It only requires one honest moment, the moment a person finally looks around and asks themselves, are the people in my life helping me grow, or are they quietly making sure I stay exactly where I am? Welcome to Wisdom Woven, the place where ancient wisdom meets real everyday life. If this is the first time here, take a moment and hit that subscribe button, because what gets shared on this channel is not just content, it is a mirror. And if something in this video hits differently, drop it in the comments. Share this with one person who needs to hear it right now. Every comment, every share, it tells the world that this kind of wisdom still matters. Now, let us get into this. There's a teaching in Buddhism that most people walk past without understanding. The Buddha once said, "It is better to walk alone than with a fool for company." Now, before anyone gets defensive, he was not talking about intelligence. He was talking about energy, about intention, about the invisible weight that certain people place on a person's shoulders simply by being present in their life. Every single person walking this earth is carrying something, a goal, a dream, a quiet hope they have never said out loud. And here's what most people do not realize. That dream is fragile in the beginning, not because the person is weak, but because new things are always fragile. A seed does not survive if someone keeps pulling it out of the ground to check if it is growing. The people around a person are either watering that seed or they are pulling it out. And the dangerous ones are not the ones who openly criticize. The dangerous ones are the ones who smile while doing it. The ones who say, "I'm just being realistic." The ones who ask, "Are you sure about this?" Every single time in that particular tone that makes a person feel like the answer should be no. Buddhism calls this concept Sangha, which means the community a person keeps. The Buddha placed enormous importance on this. He said the quality of one's companions is not just a part of the spiritual path, it is the entire spiritual path, not half of it, all of it. Because who a person spends their time with slowly becomes who that person is. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, over time, like water shaping stone. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think cutting someone off is an act of anger, of ego, of drama. But in the Buddhist understanding, it is an act of deep, quiet respect. Respect for oneself, respect for the other person, and sometimes respect for what could still be built if the weight of the wrong connections is finally set down. There is a word in the Pali language, the ancient language of Buddhist scripture, and that word is upekkha. It is often translated as equanimity, but a closer meaning is this: the ability to remain unbothered, not cold, not indifferent, but rooted, stable, unmoved by the noise of people and situations that were never meant to define this journey in the first place. Most people have never experienced what it feels like to be truly unbothered, because most people have never given themselves permission to walk away from what is draining them. They stay out of loyalty, out of guilt, out of a fear that walking away makes them a bad person. Buddhism gently disagrees, Staying in a relationship, whether friendship, family, or otherwise, that consistently pulls a person down is not loyalty. It is self-abandonment dressed up in a polite costume. The Buddha's own life tells this story beautifully. Before his enlightenment, he had 5 companions who followed him through years of extreme fasting and hardship. When he finally realized that punishing the body was not the path to wisdom and began eating again, those 5 companions left him. They thought he had given up. They walked away, disappointed. And what did the Buddha do? He sat down under a tree, alone, and found everything he had been searching for. There is something profound in that moment. He did not chase them. He did not explain himself. He did not try to convince 5 people that his direction was right. He simply turned inward. And the silence that surrounded him in that moment, that was not emptiness, that was space. Space for something extraordinary to arrive. This is the part that the modern world has completely forgotten. People are terrified of silence, terrified of being alone, and so they fill every quiet moment with noise, with people, with validation, with the constant hum of other people's opinions. Buddhism does not see silence as loneliness. Buddhism sees silence as the soil where a person finally starts to grow on their own terms. And here is the quiet irony. The moment a person stops needing everyone's approval and starts growing in silence, people notice. Not because they announced anything, not because they made a dramatic exit, but because real growth has a presence. It walks into a room differently. It speaks differently. It does not need to convince anyone of anything anymore. And that stillness is more powerful than any argument ever made out loud. This video is not about becoming cold. It is not about building walls or turning into someone who trusts nobody. That is not Buddhist wisdom. That is just fear wearing a different mask. This is about something far more precise. It is about learning to see clearly, to recognize the difference between people who add light to this journey and people who quietly, consistently dim it. The Buddha spoke of kalyana mitta, meaning noble friendship. A true friend in the Buddhist sense is not someone who always makes a person feel comfortable. A true friend is someone in whose presence a person wants to be better, someone who does not require another person to shrink to fit into their world, someone whose energy makes growth feel not just possible, but natural. Most people, if they are honest with themselves, can count those kinds of people on one hand, maybe 2 fingers, and that is perfectly fine. Buddhism was never about collecting people. It was always about choosing wisely, protecting peace fiercely, and understanding that one genuine connection is worth more than 100 hollow ones. So here's what this video is going to do. It is going to walk through something uncomfortable, something most people sense but have never had the language for. It is going to talk about how to recognize the people quietly draining this life's energy, how to cut them off, not with hate, but with grace, and how to grow in the kind of silence that eventually speaks louder than anything that came before it. Because here's the truth, and this matters. Every single day a person spends surrounded by the wrong people is a day stolen from the life they were actually meant to live. Not borrowed, stolen. And Buddhism says that time, this human life, is the rarest, most precious thing in existence. So before going any further, drop one word in the comments right now. Just one word that describes what made someone walk away from a person or situation in their life. One word. Because the answers down there, they're going to say everything. And they just might save someone else who is reading them and not yet ready to say it out loud. There is a particular kind of tired that sleep cannot fix. A person can get 8 hours, wake up in a comfortable bed, have a full day ahead, and still feel heavy before it even begins. Most people blame stress. They blame work. They blame their phone or their diet or the news. But Buddhism points somewhere else entirely. It points to the people. Not all of them, just certain ones. And the tricky part, the part that takes most people years to figure out, is that these certain ones rarely look like a problem at first. They look like a friend, they look like a cousin, a coworker who always waves. They look completely normal, and that is exactly what makes them so difficult to recognize. The Buddha once described certain kinds of people using a very specific image. He compared them to a deep lake that looks calm on the surface but pulls everything down underneath. A person can stand at the edge and see nothing wrong. The water looks still, looks safe, but the moment they step in, something changes, and by the time they realize it, they are already exhausted from swimming. This is the first sign, and it is physical before it is ever mental. A person starts noticing that after spending time with a particular individual, they feel drained. Not just tired the way any social interaction can tire an introvert, but specifically drained, like something was taken, like they walked into the conversation with a full cup and walked out not even sure where the cup went. Most people ignore this sign for years because it feels unfair to blame someone for making them tired, because there was no argument, no obvious offense, just a coffee, a phone call, a lunch, and somehow afterward the motivation is gone. The mood is quieter. The energy that was there in the morning has disappeared somewhere between the hello and the goodbye. Buddhism is very direct about this. The ancient texts describe what are called mitra patinupa, which translates to false friends, and the Buddha outlined 4 specific types, not vague categories, 4 precise descriptions that are so accurate, a person reading them today feels like they were written last Tuesday about someone they personally know. The first type is what the Buddha called the taker. This is the person who is always present when something is needed and always absent when something is asked of them. They borrow not just money, not just things, but time, attention, energy, emotional space. They take freely and generously, but when the table turns, they have somewhere to be. They are busy. They will help next time. Next time never comes. The second type is the person who speaks well but means little. Beautiful words, constant reassurance. They tell a person what they want to hear with a fluency that feels almost like love. You can do it. You are amazing. I believe in you. But watch what happens when that person actually tries something, when they take a risk, make a move, step out into something uncertain. The beautiful words disappear, and what shows up instead is a very quiet, very calculated absence. The third type is the flatterer, and this one is particularly subtle because flattery feels good. It is designed to. This is the person whose support always seems to arrive at the most convenient moment, right when a person is about to make a decision that benefits the flatterer somehow. Their praise is never really about the person they are praising. It is a tool, a soft, well-timed tool, but a tool nonetheless. The fourth type is the companion of recklessness. This is the one who is always available, but only for the wrong things. They show up for late nights and bad decisions and conversations that go nowhere and waste hours. But try asking them to join something disciplined, something early, something that requires focus or sacrifice. Suddenly, they're not that interested, because their availability was never really about the friendship, it was about their own comfort. Now, here is where Buddhism asks a very uncomfortable question. It asks, why does a person keep these people close even after recognizing what they are? And the answer is not stupidity. The answer is attachment. In Buddhist teaching, attachment is described as one of the deepest sources of human suffering, and people attach not just to things they love, but to things that feel familiar, even when familiar feels like pain. A person can know with complete clarity that a certain relationship is costing them more than it is giving them, and still find it almost impossible to step back, because that relationship is woven into their routine, their history, their sense of who they are. Cutting it feels like cutting out a part of themselves, and that fear, that strange grief of losing someone who was already hurting them, is something Buddhism understands completely without judging. There is also something else happening, something even quieter. When a person is surrounded by people who do not grow, who do not try, who do not push themselves, being around them creates an invisible ceiling, not through any dramatic conversation, just through the slow, steady normalization of staying small. Over time, a person starts to think that where they are is where they belong, because everyone around them seems fine with it. The Buddha described this as purisadhamma, the way the environment shapes the mind without the mind even being aware.
A person does not need to be told they cannot do something. They just need to spend enough time in a space where doing something is never expected, and eventually the idea of doing something begins to feel strange, out of place, like wanting something too big for the room they are standing in. And then something curious happens. When a person does try to change, when they start waking up differently, speaking differently, choosing differently, the people around them get uncomfortable. Not always with loud words, sometimes just with a look, a tone, a comment wrapped in humor that lands just a little too sharp. "Who do you think you are now?" They never say it exactly like that, but the message arrives clearly enough.
This discomfort that other people feel about someone else's growth is one of the most revealing things in any relationship. Because a person who genuinely cares, a true kalyana mitta, as the Buddha described, does not feel threatened by growth. They feel inspired by it. They feel proud of it. But someone whose connection to another person was built on that person staying the same, they feel the ground shift beneath them when change arrives. And they will, consciously or not, try to pull things back to the way they were. Recognizing this pattern is not about becoming paranoid. It is not about looking at every person with suspicion or treating every relationship as a transaction. It is about developing what Buddhism calls panya, wisdom, the quiet, clear-eyed ability to see things as they actually are, not as a person hopes they might be or fears they could become. Wisdom does not look for problems. It simply stops ignoring them. Here is a very simple practice that comes from Buddhist tradition. At the end of the day, before sleeping, a person can sit quietly for just a few minutes and ask themselves one question. After spending time with each person in their life today, did they feel more like themselves or less like themselves? Not happier necessarily, not entertained, but more themselves. Because the people worth keeping are always the ones who make a person feel more whole, not more performed, not more cautious, not more careful about every word, more whole. The hardest recognition is not identifying the people who take, it is recognizing the people who mean well but still drain everything. The ones who love genuinely, but love in a way that suffocates. The ones whose worry becomes a weight, whose need becomes a wall. Buddhism does not say those people are bad. It says the path still has to be walked, and some people, no matter how much they are loved, cannot walk it with you. And that truth does not require anger to be honored. It only requires honesty. Because once a person can see clearly, once the fog of habit and guilt and history lifts just enough to reveal what is actually happening in the relationships around them, something shifts. It does not feel like betrayal anymore. It does not feel like cruelty. It feels like the first honest breath taken in a very long time. And Buddhism says that honest breath, that single clear moment of seeing things as they are, that is where the real journey begins. Not at the destination, right there, in the seeing. There is a story that almost nobody talks about when they talk about Buddhism. Not the enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, not the famous teachings in the deer park. A much earlier story, a quieter one. The story of a prince who had everything, a palace, a family, wealth beyond what most people can even imagine, and still felt something was deeply, unbearably wrong. Not because life had treated him badly, but because he could see with painful clarity that everything he was holding on to was going to disappear, and nobody around him wanted to talk about that. That prince was Siddhartha, and the thing that eventually broke him open was not poverty, not failure, not loss in the way most people experience loss. It was the realization that attachment itself, the act of clinging to people, to comfort, to the way things are, was the very thing quietly manufacturing his suffering. Not the world, not other people, the clinging, that specific invisible act of holding on too tightly to what was never meant to be permanent. This became the foundation of everything the Buddha would later teach,
and it is one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of human philosophy. When people hear that Buddhism teaches non-attachment, most of them picture something cold, something detached in the emotional sense, a monk who feels nothing, wants nothing, cares for nobody. That is not what non-attachment means, not even close. Non-attachment means loving something fully and still being at peace with the fact that it will change. It means caring deeply without making that care into a chain around the wrist. The Buddha identified attachment as one of the 3 root causes of suffering. In Pali, it is called upadana, which translates most accurately not as attachment, but as clinging. And the distinction matters. Attachment can be warm, clinging is desperate. Attachment can be natural, clinging is fear in disguise. A person can be attached to someone they love and still let them be free. But clinging turns every relationship into a slow negotiation between love and control. And here is where it connects to the people in a person's life. When someone clings to a relationship, even one that is clearly harmful, it is almost never because they do not see the damage. Most people, on some level, see it. They feel it every time they leave that person's company, feeling emptier than before. They feel it in the way certain conversations replay in their mind for days. They feel it in the tiredness that has no obvious explanation. But they cling anyway, because somewhere underneath all of it is a fear that is older than the relationship itself. Buddhism identifies several forms of clinging. One of the most powerful is clinging to identity, to who a person believes they are based on who they are connected to. A person who has been someone's best friend for 15 years, who they are in that friendship is part of how they understand themselves. Removing that friendship does not just mean losing a person. It means, in some quiet and terrifying way, losing a version of oneself. And that is a grief that most people are completely unprepared for. This is why the Buddhist teachings spend so much time on the concept of anatta, which means no fixed self. The idea that a person is not a permanent, unchanging thing, that who someone is today is not who they were 10 years ago and not who they will be 10 years from now. And this is not a sad thing in Buddhism. It is one of the most liberating ideas ever spoken aloud. Because if a person is not fixed, if they are always in the process of becoming, then no relationship, no identity, no version of themselves is worth clinging to at the cost of their own peace. There is a very old Buddhist metaphor that describes attachment with remarkable accuracy. It speaks of a person crossing a river on a raft. The raft is useful. The raft gets them across. But once they reach the other shore, they do not carry the raft on their back for the rest of the journey. They leave it at the water's edge with gratitude and move forward. Some relationships are exactly like that raft. They served a purpose, a real, genuine, important purpose. But the shore has been reached, and carrying the raft further is not loyalty. It is just extra weight on a road that still has a long way to go. The suffering that comes from not putting down that raft is something Buddhism describes with a word that has no perfect English translation: dukkha. It is often translated as suffering, but dukkha is more textured than that. It describes the low, constant dissatisfaction of a life spent slightly out of alignment. Not traumatic pain necessarily, just the persistent feeling that something is off, that something important is being missed, that life is happening slightly beside a person rather than through them. And clinging to the wrong connections is one of the quietest, most consistent causes of dukkha that exists. Here is something that rarely gets said. A person can create enormous suffering not just by clinging to people who are harmful, but by clinging to a version of those people that only ever existed in their own mind. The idea of who someone was, the memory of who they used to be, the hope of who they might become. The Buddha called this papancha, the tendency of the mind to elaborate, to spin stories, to build entire worlds around a projection rather than a reality. A person does not always grieve the friend they lost. Sometimes they grieve the friend they wished they had. And this kind of grief is particularly cruel because it has no clean resolution. A person cannot mourn something that never fully existed. They cannot have a conversation with an image they constructed. They cannot get closure from a version of someone that lived only in their own expectations. Buddhism says the path through this specific pain is not analysis. It is not more thinking. It is the quiet, patient practice of seeing what is actually there. Not what was hoped for, not what was feared, but what is simply, plainly, undeniably true. The Buddha spoke about this in a teaching called the Sabbasava Sutta, where he described the different ways suffering arises in the mind. One of the clearest passages describes how people create suffering by asking the wrong questions. Questions like, was this person always like this? Did they ever truly care? Was any of it real? These questions feel important, they feel necessary, but Buddhism says they are traps. They pull a person deeper into the past when all of the healing, every single piece of it, lives in the present moment. There is also a very specific kind of attachment that Buddhism identifies as particularly difficult to release, and that is the attachment to being right about a person. Once a mind has decided that someone is trustworthy, kind, a good friend, a genuine support, it resists updating that decision, because updating it means admitting something uncomfortable. It means accepting that judgment was off, that time was spent, that energy was given to something that did not deserve it. And the ego, the small, protective, storytelling part of the human mind, finds that almost unbearable.
The Buddha had a very precise word for this kind of ego protection. He called it mana, which translates as conceit, but not in the arrogant sense. Mana is the subtle, constant comparing and measuring the mind does to protect its own sense of having gotten things right. It is the part of a person that would rather stay in a bad situation than admit they should have left it sooner. Buddhism does not shame this quality. It simply names it. Because the first step to releasing anything, including a harmful connection, is seeing clearly what has been keeping it in place. Now here is where the teaching becomes genuinely practical. The Buddha did not offer non-attachment as a philosophy to admire from a distance. He offered it as a daily practice. And that practice begins not with dramatic decisions, but with small, honest observations. Noticing when a thought about a person brings peace or brings contraction. Noticing when anticipating a conversation feels like relief or dread. Noticing, without judgment, what the body is already trying to say long before the mind is ready to listen. Because the body, Buddhism suggests, is often wiser than the stories the mind keeps telling. There is a meditation practice rooted in early Buddhist tradition called vipassana, which means seeing clearly. And while it is a formal sitting practice, its principle can be applied anywhere. The principle is simply this: observe without reacting. Watch what arises in the mind and body without immediately trying to fix it, explain it, or make it mean something. When a person applies this to their relationships, when they sit with the discomfort of a connection that no longer serves them without immediately reaching for a justification, something remarkable begins to happen. The truth becomes very hard to argue with. Buddhism also teaches something that modern psychology has only recently begun to catch up to, that suffering shared with the wrong person does not have the pain, it compounds it. When a person brings their vulnerability, their fears, their real inner world to someone who does not have the capacity or the intention to honor it, they do not feel better afterward. They feel exposed. They feel smaller. And slowly, over time, they stop sharing at all. Not just with that person, with everyone. Because the wound of misplaced trust has a long reach. The concept of karuna in Buddhism, which translates as compassion, is often applied outward. Compassion for others. Compassion for the difficult people, the draining ones, the ones who take without giving. And that compassion is real and important and worth practicing. But Buddhism is equally clear that karuna must also be applied inward, that a person cannot pour genuine compassion outward from an empty vessel.
that protecting one's own peace is not selfishness, it is the very foundation from which real care for others eventually grows. So what does a person actually do with all of this? What is the practical application of understanding that attachment causes suffering, that clinging prolongs pain, that the self is not fixed and the raft can be left at the shore? Buddhism gives a very simple answer. Not an easy answer, but a simple one. Begin with honesty. Not the kind of honesty that is announced to others, the kind that happens privately, quietly, in the honest corners of one's own mind. The kind where a person stops pretending that something is fine when every part of them already knows it is not. Because once that honesty arrives, once a person stops performing peace and starts actually looking for it, the attachment begins to loosen on its own. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the way ice loosens in the first warmth of spring. Gradually, quietly, without force. And the Buddha's greatest promise was not that this path would be painless, it was that it was real. That on the other side of honest seeing, something genuinely different was waiting. Not a perfect life, not a life without difficulty, but a life lived with open hands instead of clenched fists. And that, according to everything the Buddha ever taught, makes all the difference. Nobody talks about the moment right before. Not the decision itself, but the moment right before the decision. When a person is sitting with the full weight of knowing that a relationship needs to end and feeling completely paralyzed by it. Not because they do not know what to do, but because doing it feels like becoming someone they do not recognize. Someone who walks away. Someone who chooses themselves. And somewhere along the way, most people were quietly taught that choosing themselves was the same thing as being selfish. Buddhism has something very direct to say about that particular lie. The word most people use when they think about cutting someone off is wrong from the very beginning. Cutting off sounds violent. It sounds sudden and sharp and final in a way that carries guilt inside the phrase itself. Buddhism does not use that language. Buddhism speaks instead of nekkhamma, which translates as renunciation. But renunciation in the Buddhist sense does not mean rejection. It means a conscious, deliberate, peaceful release. It is the difference between throwing something away in anger and setting it down with both hands open. Same result, completely different energy. And that energy matters more than most people realize, because the way a person releases something determines what they carry forward. A person who cuts someone off in rage carries the rage. A person who severs a connection in guilt carries the guilt. But a person who releases a relationship with clarity and compassion, who understands why it served its time and why it no longer can, that person walks forward lighter. Not because the relationship meant nothing, but because the release was handled with the same care the relationship once deserved. The first thing Buddhism asks a person to do before any kind of release is to sit with something called samma sankappa, right intention. To ask honestly, why is this ending? Is it anger? Is it ego? Is it a bad week that will look different in a month? Or is it something deeper, a genuine, sustained, clear recognition that this connection is no longer aligned with where this life needs to go? Right intention does not judge the answer, it only insists on an honest one. Because a release built on honest intention heals. A release built on impulse or temporary pain just creates a different version of the same wound. Here is something that almost everyone gets backwards. Most people think the guilt they feel about walking away is a sign that they are a good person, that the harder it is to leave, the more it proves they cared. And while there is some truth in that, the guilt itself is not a signal to stay. Buddhism describes guilt as a form of suffering that arises when a person's action conflicts with their sense of self. But if a person's sense of self has been shaped by other people's expectations, by the idea that loyalty means staying regardless of the cost, then that guilt is not wisdom, it is conditioning. And conditioning can be examined, it can be questioned, it does not have to be obeyed. There is a teaching from the Dhammapada, one of the oldest and most direct collections of the Buddha's words, that speaks to this with quiet precision. It says that a person who protects themselves protects others. That might sound strange at first. It sounds almost too convenient, like permission slipped into philosophy. But the meaning is genuine. A person who is depleted cannot give. A person who is resentful cannot be kind. A person who stays in a connection that is slowly hollowing them out will eventually have nothing left to offer anyone. Not the person they stayed for, not the people who actually need them, and not themselves. So what does the actual release look like? Because this is where most advice becomes vague. Set boundaries, distance yourself, choose your peace. These phrases have been said so many times they have lost all practical weight. Buddhism is more specific than that. It begins not with the other person, but entirely with the self. Before any conversation happens, before any distance is created, a person must first become clear within themselves, not just about what they are leaving, but about what they are moving toward. Because release without direction is just another kind of lost. The Buddhist practice of metta, loving-kindness meditation, is one of the most powerful tools for this specific moment, and it works in a way that surprises most people who try it. A person sits quietly and begins by offering goodwill to themselves, genuinely, not as a performance, but as a sincere wish. May I be well, may I be at peace, may I be free from suffering. Then, gradually, they extend that same wish to the person they are releasing. Not because that person deserves it in some transactional sense, but because sending someone away with hatred or bitterness is like drinking poison and expecting them to suffer. Metta does not excuse what happened, it simply refuses to carry it forward.
This is the part that challenges people the most. Because the mind wants justice. It wants the other person to understand what they did. It wants acknowledgement, apology, some visible sign that the pain was real and that it mattered. And sometimes that happens. But Buddhism is honest about the fact that it very often does not. Most people who drain others are not aware they are doing it. Most people who take without giving have built an entire inner world that makes their behavior feel completely reasonable from the inside. Waiting for someone like that to arrive at understanding before releasing them, that is not patience. That is a sentence with no end date. There is a story from the Buddhist tradition about a monk who was insulted by a man in the marketplace. The man screamed at the monk, called him names, said terrible things in front of everyone. The monk stood quietly and then asked the man, "If you offer someone a gift and they do not accept it, who does the gift belong to?" The man said, "To me, obviously." The monk nodded and walked away. The insult, the anger, the bitterness the man had thrown, the monk had simply chosen not to receive it. And what a person does not receive cannot harm them. The same principle applies to guilt that others project, to the expectation that walking away requires permission, that peace requires an apology before it can begin. Now, there are different kinds of release, and Buddhism does not pretend they are all the same. Some connections can be released gradually, through gentle distance, through less availability, through redirecting energy slowly and without announcement. Others require a direct, honest conversation, and some, particularly those involving manipulation, emotional harm, or patterns that have repeated too many times to count, require a clean, immediate, uncompromising step back with no explanation offered as a bargaining chip. Because an explanation given to someone who will use it to argue is not closure. It is just another door left open for the same wind to blow through. The Buddha was remarkably specific about speech during difficult moments. He taught what is known as samavaka, right speech. And right speech in the context of releasing a relationship means this: say what is true, say what is necessary, say it with kindness, and say nothing beyond that. Not the list of grievances, not the history of every moment that built to this one, not the carefully constructed argument designed to make the other person finally see, just the truth, simply, kindly, and then silence. Because silence after right speech is not coldness, it is completion. One of the most overlooked aspects of this entire process is what happens in the body. Buddhism has always understood, long before modern neuroscience confirmed it, that emotion is not just a mental event. It lives in the shoulders, in the chest, in the jaw, in the stomach. And when a person has been in a draining relationship for a long time, the body has memorized that dynamic. It has learned to brace, to prepare, to hold itself in a particular way around that person. Releasing the relationship is important, but releasing what the body has stored, that requires its own kind of attention. Breath, movement, stillness, time. The body deserves the same gentleness being extended to the mind. Here is something Buddhism says that most people find unexpectedly comforting. A person does not need to stop caring about someone in order to stop being close to them. These two things are not the same. A person can genuinely wish someone well, can hope they find their peace, their growth, their own path forward, while simultaneously knowing that they cannot be the one walking beside them anymore. This is not contradiction. This is one of the more mature forms of love that exists, the kind that does not need proximity to be real, the kind that can say, "I wish you everything good and I need to go now." The guilt that resurfaces, because it will resurface, sometimes weeks or months after the release, has a very particular texture. It often arrives not as a logical argument, but as a memory, a good one. The time that person showed up when it mattered, the years of history, the inside jokes, the version of them that existed before whatever came after. Buddhism does not ask a person to delete those memories or pretend they were not real. It simply asks that the memories be seen as what they are, the past, not evidence that the present decision is wrong, not proof that the release was a mistake, just the past, allowed to be what it was without being allowed to govern what comes next.
There will also be people who do not understand the release. Friends of friends, mutual connections, people who only see one side and have already decided what that side means. Buddhism calls this loka dhamma, the worldly winds. Praise and blame, fame and obscurity, pleasure and pain, gain and loss. The Buddha listed 8 of these winds and pointed out that every human life will be blown by all of them at some point. A person who has built their peace on the inside, on their own clear-eyed understanding of why they did what they did, will not be uprooted by what others say about it. But a person whose peace depends on being understood by everyone will find that wind unbearable. This is why the Buddhist path emphasizes inner clarity before outer action. Not because the outer action is unimportant, it is very important, but because an action taken from a clear, settled, honest place within a person will hold. It will not need to be defended or revisited or explained to every passing opinion. It will simply stand, quiet, firm, the way a tree stands in wind, not because it refuses to move, but because the roots go deep enough that moving does not mean falling. And then something unexpected begins to happen. After the release, after the initial discomfort of unfamiliar space, a person begins to notice things they had stopped noticing. They notice their own thoughts more clearly. They notice their mood in the morning before any external influence arrives. They notice that certain ideas they had suppressed, certain directions they had quietly given up on are still there, patient, waiting, as alive as they ever were. Buddhism calls this the natural arising of wisdom when the obstructions are cleared. Not something built from scratch, something uncovered, something that was always there underneath everything that had been piled on top of it. Cutting someone off without guilt or anger is not a destination, it is a practice. And like all Buddhist practice, it does not ask for perfection. It asks for honesty, for patience with the process, for the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than run from it, for the quiet daily courage to choose again and again the life that is actually being lived over the life that simply became familiar. Because the Buddha's entire teaching rests on one radical premise, that suffering is not inevitable, that it arises from specific causes, and that those causes, when seen clearly, when released with compassion, can be let go, not perfectly, not all at once, but genuinely. And that genuine release, no matter how quiet, no matter how unseen by the world, changes everything. There is a particular phase in a person's life that does not get celebrated. Nobody posts about it. Nobody throws a gathering in its honor. There are no visible milestones to point to, no announcements to make, no obvious evidence that anything meaningful is even happening. From the outside, it looks like stillness. It looks like withdrawal. It looks to people who do not understand it like giving up. But Buddhism has a completely different name for this phase. It calls it the most important one. Think about a seed for a moment. Not the planting, not the flowering, the part in between, the long, dark, invisible stretch where the seed is underground doing the most critical work of its entire existence. No light reaches it. Nobody can see it. There is no proof to offer the world that anything is happening at all, and yet everything is happening. The root system is forming, the foundation that will eventually hold an entire tree upright through decades of wind and rain is being quietly, invisibly constructed. That underground phase, that is not weakness, that is the whole game. The Buddha understood this with the kind of depth that only comes from living it personally. Before his enlightenment, before the teachings, before the thousands of people who would eventually sit and listen, there was a man sitting alone under a tree in the dark. No audience, no validation, no one watching to confirm that what he was doing had any value. Just stillness, just the breath, just an unwavering commitment to going inward when everything in the world was pulling outward. And from that unremarkable, unseen, utterly quiet moment, something extraordinary emerged. Most people are terrified of that kind of quiet, and it is worth understanding why, because the fear is not random. Modern life has built an entire architecture designed to make silence feel dangerous. The moment a person goes quiet, the notifications arrive. The moment they stop talking, the algorithm stops rewarding them. The moment they pull back from people and performances and the constant proving of themselves, the world treats that silence as absence, as failure, as something to be fixed. Buddhism sees it as the opposite. Buddhism sees it as a rival.
There is a concept in Zen Buddhism called wu-wei, which originates in Taoist philosophy but flows deeply through Buddhist thought as well. It translates loosely as effortless action, or more accurately, acting in complete alignment with one's own nature, without force, without performance, without the exhausting effort of trying to be seen. Wu-wei is not laziness, it is not passivity. It is the kind of action that arises from such a deep and settled place within a person that it no longer costs them anything to do it. It flows. And the quiet phase, the growing in silence phase, is where a person first discovers what that feels like. Here is something that took many people years to understand, and Buddhism points to it with quiet consistency. The version of a person that the world knows is not the whole person, it is the performed version. The version that has learned over years of social conditioning to present certain things and hide others, to lead with what is acceptable and suppress what is not. And that performance, while often necessary, is also exhausting. It takes energy, real energy, the same energy that could otherwise be used to grow, to create, to move toward whatever actually matters to that person deep down. Silence is where the performance stops. And when the performance stops, the real person finally gets a turn. The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah, one of the most beloved monks of the 20th century, once said something that stopped people mid-breath when they heard it. He said that if a person lets go a little, they will have a little peace. If they let go a lot, they will have a lot of peace. If they let go completely, they will have complete peace. Most people apply this to dramatic things, grief, trauma, major losses. But Ajahn Chah was also talking about the small daily letting go of needing to be understood, needing to be seen, needing the quiet growth happening inside to be validated by something happening outside. That letting go, that specific release, is where the silence becomes powerful instead of painful. There is a reason the most transformative periods in great people's lives are almost never the ones they were loudest during. The years of visible success get documented. The quiet years before them, the ones spent reading alone, thinking deeply, failing privately, rebuilding without an audience, those years are almost always invisible in the biography. But they are always the foundation, every single time.
And Buddhism has been pointing to this pattern for thousands of years through a very simple observation. Real depth cannot be performed, it can only be developed. And development requires conditions that noise and constant social presence make almost impossible to maintain. Now here is where this becomes very personal and very practical. When a person first enters this quiet phase, especially after releasing draining connections, the silence feels wrong before it feels right. There is a period of discomfort that is almost physical in its intensity. The phone feels heavier. The evenings feel longer. The absence of certain voices, even ones that were not good for them, creates a strange hollow sound in the space they used to occupy. Buddhism does not promise that this part is comfortable, it only promises that it is temporary, and that what comes after it, if a person stays with it instead of running from it, is worth every uncomfortable moment. The Buddhist concept of sati, mindfulness, is at its most powerful not in the structured meditation session, but in exactly this kind of ordinary quiet. When a person is alone with themselves, with no one to react to and no performance to maintain, the mind reveals itself with startling honesty. Thoughts arise that have been waiting patiently under the noise of social life. Desires surface that have been suppressed by the opinions of others. Clarity arrives, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow, steady sharpening, like eyes adjusting to the dark until shapes that were invisible begin to emerge with perfect precision. There is something almost ironic about what happens to a person's relationships during the quiet phase. The ones that were never real tend to fall away naturally because they were built on availability, on being easy to reach, on the person always showing up in the way those connections needed. When that changes, when the person becomes less immediately available, less eager to explain themselves, less present in the social spaces they used to occupy, certain people simply drift. No drama, no confrontation, just a gradual, natural separation that reveals in its own quiet way exactly what those connections were actually built on. But something else also happens. The connections that are real, the rare ones, the Kalyana Mita friendships the Buddha described, those do not drift, they hold. Not because of obligation or habit, but because they were never dependent on performance in the first place. These are the people who reach out, not because they need something, but because they genuinely wondered how a person is doing. And when contact is made after weeks of quiet, there is no weight in it, no guilt, no catching up for the sake of appearances, just two people who understand each other well enough to survive each other's silence. And that understanding is one of the rarest and most valuable things in any human life. Buddhism speaks about the quality of the mind that emerges from sustained silence through the concept of samadhi, which is often translated as concentration, but is more accurately described as a collected, unified mind. A mind that is no longer scattered across 100 different social obligations, 100 different versions of itself being performed for 100 different audiences. A mind that has been gathered back to its center. And from that center, from that collected, quiet, fully present place, a person begins to think differently. Not just more clearly, differently. New directions appear, old assumptions dissolve. Solutions to problems that seemed permanent arrive as if from nowhere, but they did not come from nowhere. They came from the silence. They were always there. They just could not be heard over the noise. There is a practice in certain Buddhist monasteries where monks observe periods of complete silence, not just refraining from speech, but from all unnecessary communication. No gestures, no expressions used for social performance, no effort to signal anything to anyone. And what monks consistently report from these periods is not emptiness, but fullness. A strange, unexpected richness to ordinary moments that were previously passed through without any real attention. The taste of food, the sound of rain, the simple sensation of breath moving through the body. Silence does not shrink a person's world, it expands it, because suddenly the present moment, which was always there, finally has room to be noticed. Now, this does not mean a person growing in silence becomes someone who never speaks, never connects, never engages with the world around them. That would be escapism, not growth. Buddhism makes a very clear distinction between the silence that is a stepping stone and the silence that becomes a hiding place. One is a phase of deep internal work that eventually produces something worth bringing back into the world. The other is simply a more elaborate form of avoidance. The difference lies in what the silence is being used for. Is it building something genuine, or is it just hiding from something uncomfortable? The Buddha himself did not stay under the tree. After his enlightenment, after the silence had done what only silence could do, he rose and walked toward people, toward the world, toward all the noise and suffering and beautiful difficulty of human life. But he walked there differently. He walked there from a place so internally settled that nothing the world threw at him could uproot it. The silence had not removed him from life, it had prepared him for it in a way that years of activity never could have. That is the promise of the quiet phase. Not permanent withdrawal, but a return on entirely different terms. Here is what nobody tells a person when they first go quiet. The ideas start coming. Slowly at first, then with increasing frequency and clarity. Ideas about who they actually are beneath all the social layers. Ideas about what they actually want when nobody else's opinion is factored in. Ideas about what they could create, build, pursue if they stopped spending the best hours of their days managing other people's perceptions of them. Buddhism describes this as the natural unfolding of panna, wisdom, when the conditions for it are finally created. Wisdom is not imported from outside, it is uncovered from within, and silence is the most reliable tool for that uncovering that has ever existed. There is also a profound physical dimension to this that Buddhism has always honored. The body changes during a genuine period of quiet growth. The jaw unclenches, the shoulders drop from where they had been permanently raised, prepared for the next social negotiation. Sleep deepens, appetite regulates. The nervous system, which had been running a low-grade emergency response for so long it had started to feel normal, begins to recalibrate. Buddhism would not use the language of neuroscience to describe this, but would recognize it immediately. It is the body returning to its natural state, the state it was always trying to find underneath the constant stimulation of a life lived entirely outward.
And then comes the moment. And it arrives differently for every person, but it always arrives when the quiet stops feeling like deprivation and starts feeling like wealth. When an evening alone with honest thoughts feels more nourishing than a night surrounded by people who do not truly see them. When the absence of certain conversations feels not like loneliness, but like relief. When a person looks at the space they have created around themselves and feels, perhaps for the first time in a long time, that they are finally living inside a life that actually belongs to them. Buddhism calls this the beginning of real freedom, not the end of anything, the beginning. Because the quietest phase is not the ending of a story, it is the part where the story finally becomes true. Every version that came before it, the version built for approval, the version maintained for belonging, the version shaped by the expectations of people who are no longer even present, all of those versions were drafts. Necessary, perhaps, but drafts. The quiet phase is where a person sits down with the whole manuscript of their life and reads it honestly for the first time, sees what was always theirs and what was borrowed, keeps what matters, sets down what does not, and then, with clear eyes and a steadier breath than they have felt in years, begins again, from the inside out, in the most powerful silence they have ever known. There is a moment that arrives quietly, no trumpet, no dramatic signal, no obvious sign that anything significant is shifted. A person is simply going about their day, making tea, walking somewhere ordinary, sitting in a room they have sat in 100 times before, and something feels different.
Not the room, not the tea, not the ordinary walk. Something inside the person feels different. Settled in a way it has not been settled in a very long time. And if they are honest with themselves, if they sit with that feeling instead of immediately reaching for an explanation, they will recognize it. This is what it feels like to finally be living a life that belongs to them. Not performed for anyone, not maintained for approval, just theirs, quiet and real and entirely their own. This entire journey, everything explored across every part of this video, was never really about other people. That is the truth that only becomes visible at the end. It looked like a conversation about toxic connections and draining relationships and the people who hold others back, and on the surface, it was. But underneath every layer of that conversation was something more personal, more intimate, more uncomfortably close to home. It was always a conversation about the choices a person makes about themselves, about what they are willing to protect, about what they decide, quietly, without announcement, they are worth. The Buddhist teachings were never designed to be comfortable, they were designed to be true. And the truth they keep returning to, across every story, every sutta, every metaphor, every teaching from every tradition that has carried this wisdom forward through 2,500 years, is this: suffering is not the permanent condition of human life. It is the result of specific, identifiable causes. And those causes, attachment, clinging, the refusal to see things as they actually are, can be worked with. Not eliminated in a single revelation, but worked with, honestly, daily, with patience and without self-deception. And that working, that quiet, unglamorous, deeply personal practice genuinely changes things. Every person who has ever walked away from something that was draining them knows a specific kind of fear. The fear that the walking away was wrong, that loyalty should have won, that time would have fixed what presence could not. Buddhism does not dismiss that fear, it honors it, because it comes from a genuine place, from the part of a person that takes connection seriously, that does not abandon things lightly, that understands the weight of choosing to leave. But Buddhism also says clearly and without apology that fear is not a reason to stay. It is simply a feeling, and feelings, however powerful, however insistent, however convincingly dressed as wisdom, are not the same as truth. Something remarkable happens when a person looks back at the connections they released, not immediately after, when the wound is still fresh and the justifications are still being constructed, but from a real distance. Months later, sometimes years, they see things they could not see from inside it. They see the version of themselves that existed within that dynamic, smaller, more careful, more performative, less honest. And they feel something unexpected, not anger at what was lost, gratitude for what was finally found. The version of themselves that exists now, quieter perhaps, more selective, less easily impressed and less easily threatened, that version was not possible inside the old dynamic. The leaving was the making of them.
Buddhism speaks about the concept of bodhi, awakening. And while the word carries enormous spiritual weight in traditional contexts, its most practical meaning is simpler than most people expect. Awakening is not a supernatural event. It is not reserved for monks or mystics or people with decades of formal practice. In its most ordinary and accessible form, awakening is simply the moment a person stops deceiving themselves about something important. The moment they see a situation, a relationship, a pattern, a belief about who they are, clearly and without the protective fog of habit or wishful thinking. That moment, that simple, honest, often uncomfortable moment of clear seeing, Buddhism calls that awakening. And it is available to every person, in every ordinary life, at any moment they are willing to look without flinching. There will be people watching this video who are right at the edge of a decision, who have known for longer than they would like to admit that something in their life needs to change, a connection that needs releasing, a pattern that needs interrupting, a version of themselves that needs to be gently and firmly set down. And they have been waiting for the right time, for certainty, for someone to tell them it is allowed. Buddhism has a very specific message for those people. The right time is a myth constructed by the mind that does not want to do the uncomfortable thing. Certainty is not the prerequisite for action, it is the reward for taking it. And permission, the only permission that has ever mattered, is the person's own. The silence that waits on the other side of releasing the wrong things is not the silence of emptiness. It has been said throughout this video in different ways, and it is worth saying plainly one final time. The silence is full. It is the fullness of a mind that has stopped running the constant background calculations of social management and performance. It is the fullness of energy that is no longer being quietly consumed by dynamics that were never reciprocal. It is the fullness of a person who has, perhaps for the first time in a long time, enough internal space to hear their own thoughts clearly, and more importantly, to trust them. Buddhism describes the final fruit of genuine practice with a word that most people have heard but few have felt: nibbana. In its highest form, it represents a liberation beyond ordinary comprehension. But in its most immediate, daily, and accessible form, nibbana is simply the absence of burning, the absence of the constant internal fire of craving, aversion, and confusion that most people accept as the normal temperature of a human life. When the wrong connections are released, when the rebuilding happens honestly, when the protective habits are practiced consistently, the burning quiets, not all at once, but measurably, noticeably, in the body as much as in the mind. And what remains when the burning quiets, that cool, clear, spacious quality of simply being, that is not nothing. That is everything the searching was always actually looking for. There is a final Buddhist story that belongs here. After the Buddha's enlightenment, a wandering ascetic encountered him on the road. The ascetic could see immediately that something was different about this man, something in the way he walked, the way he held himself, the extraordinary quality of stillness that surrounded him. The ascetic asked, "Are you a god?" The Buddha said, "No." "A spirit?" "No." "An angel?" "No." "Then what are you?" the ascetic asked. The Buddha gave an answer that has traveled 2,500 years to arrive in this moment. He said, "I am awake." That was it. Not a title, not a claim of supernatural power, just the simple, radical statement of a person who had finally, completely stopped being asleep to their own life. And that wakefulness, that ordinary, available, quietly revolutionary wakefulness, is what this entire journey has been pointing toward. A person reading these words right now, wherever they are, whatever brought them to this conversation, they are not at the beginning of something. They are further along than they realize. The fact that they were drawn to this conversation, that they stayed with it, that something in the words landed in a place that felt familiar and true, that is not coincidence. That is recognition. The part of them that already knows, the part that has always known, the part that has been quietly, patiently waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Buddhism calls that part Buddha nature, the inherent capacity for clarity and peace that exists inside every human being without exception, not as a potential to be achieved, as a reality to be uncovered. And the uncovering begins always, only, without exception, with honesty, with clear seeing, with the willingness to look at what is actually there and respond to it truthfully.
This is not a video about becoming someone else. That is the misunderstanding most self-improvement content quietly encourages, that somewhere ahead is a better version waiting to be built, and the current version is just the inadequate raw material. Buddhism rejects that entirely. There is no better version waiting ahead. There is only the current person, this exact person, with the layers of accumulated conditioning, misplaced loyalty, absorbed expectations, and borrowed identities gently and honestly removed. What remains after that removal is not less, it is the original. And the original, stripped of everything that was never truly theirs, is more than enough. It always was.
The world is going to keep doing what the world does. People will continue to arrive in this life carrying their own wounds, their own limitations, their own unconscious ways of taking more than they give. That will not change. The external landscape of human relationship is not something any individual practice can alter, but what practice can alter, what it reliably, demonstrably, profoundly alters, is the person moving through that landscape. Their vision becomes clearer, their choices become more deliberate, their peace becomes less dependent on what others do or do not do. And from that altered internal position, the same external world becomes an entirely different experience to navigate. Buddhism has been proving this for longer than most countries have existed, not as philosophy, as practice, as lived, tested, ordinary human experience. Cutting people off is not the destination. Growing quietly is not the destination. Even the profound peace that Buddhist practice cultivates is not, in its deepest understanding, the destination. The destination, if that word can even be used honestly, is simply this: a person who is fully, honestly, completely present to their own life, who makes their choices from a place of genuine clarity rather than fear or habit or the managed opinions of people who were never truly invested in their flourishing, who can sit with silence without running from it, who can release what needs releasing without bitterness, who can grow without needing an audience, who can love without losing themselves. That person, living that ordinary, quiet, genuinely awake life, is what every teaching in this video has been building toward. And that person is not a distant ideal. They are who every viewer of this video already is, underneath everything that was never truly theirs to carry. There is one more thing that needs to be said, and it is perhaps the most important thing, not because it is the most profound philosophically, but because it is the most immediately, practically true. This work does not end. There is no morning a person wakes up and discovers they have permanently graduated from the need for honest self-examination. No point of arrival where the habits can be abandoned and the peace will simply maintain itself without attention. The Buddha himself, even after his enlightenment, even with the extraordinary clarity that earned him that title, continued to sit, continued to practice, continued to live the principles rather than simply teaching them from a comfortable distance. Because the path is not what leads to the life. The path is the life, and walking it, not perfectly, not dramatically, but consistently and honestly, is the whole practice. So here is what needs to happen now. Not tomorrow, not after a few more days of thinking about it, now. Whatever in this video landed as true, whatever recognition arose during these words that felt like something already known being finally named, that needs to be honored with action. Small action, honest action. The kind that does not need to be announced or explained to anyone. The quiet kind. The kind that happens in ordinary moments that nobody else will ever know about, but that accumulate over time into an entirely different life. Buddhism calls this padana, the right effort applied in the right direction at the right moment. And the right moment is almost always closer than the mind that is still deciding wants to admit. Every single person who stayed with this video from the beginning to this final moment deserves to hear something clearly. What they were looking for when they clicked on this video, that thing underneath the surface reason, the deeper question they have been carrying, they already have the answer to it. They have always had it. The teachings offered here, the stories, the Buddhist concepts, the careful unpacking of why certain connections cost more than they give and why silence is stronger than it appears, none of that created anything new in the person watching. It simply pointed to what was already there. The compass has always been internal. It has always been pointing in the right direction. The only question that has ever mattered is whether a person is finally willing to follow it. If this video moved something in a person, if even one idea landed in a place that shifted something real, then please do something with that.
Share this video with someone who needs it. Someone who is still inside a situation they have already outgrown but cannot yet name. Someone who is carrying weight that was never theirs to carry. Someone who is ready to hear what they have always already known. That one share might reach exactly the person who needed these words more than anything else they would have encountered today. And that matters. In a world with no shortage of noise, something true traveling from one person to another is not a small thing. It is how wisdom has always moved, person to person, quietly, without fanfare, exactly the way real things travel. And if this channel, Wisdom Woven, has offered something genuine across this video, then please subscribe. Not as a transaction, not because a number on a screen means anything significant, but because the conversation being built here is one worth continuing. There's more to explore, more ancient wisdom that speaks with startling accuracy to the exact difficulties of this very specific moment in human history. More questions worth sitting with, more silence worth learning how to inhabit. Subscribe, leave a comment, not a performance but a real one. One honest sentence about where this journey currently stands. Because those comments are not just engagement for an algorithm. They are a person choosing to say, I was here, I heard this, something in me recognized something true. And that recognition, that small, quiet, completely ordinary act of honest acknowledgement is exactly where every worthwhile journey begins. The silence is waiting. It has always been waiting. Patient and full and completely indifferent to how long it takes to arrive. And it will wait as long as it needs to, because it is not going anywhere. It is not a destination that can be missed. It is the ground beneath every step that has ever been taken. Buddhism has been saying this for 2,500 years, and today, in this ordinary moment, in whatever unremarkable place these words are being encountered, the invitation is exactly the same as it has always been. Go quiet, grow honestly, cut away what was never truly yours with compassion and without apology, and then simply live, fully, clearly, in the extraordinary, ordinary silence of a life that finally, genuinely, completely belongs to you.